Hey, welcome to Janktown. Will here, and today I'll be walking you guys through our deck primer featuring the Bat God of Ixalan, Aclazotz Deepest Betrayal. So Aclazotz is a 5-mana value 4/4 flying lifelinker that reads, whenever Aclazotz attacks, each opponent discards a card, and for each opponent who can't, we then draw a card. Now when an opponent discards a land card, we create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. And when Aclazotz dies, we then return to the battlefield tapped and transformed under our control. The backside is a land that taps for black mana, but we can pay 3 and tap it and transform it back to its front side, provided a player has 1 or fewer cards in hand and only at sorcery speed. So for this video, I'll be walking you guys through how our deck runs, talk a bit about our commander, and get into specific card choices and talk about why these are the cards that we're running. The full deck list will be available in the description down below, so if that sounds good to you, I hope you can leave a like, share, and subscribe because it really helps the channel out. And so with that out of the way, let's get into this analysis. So let's break down our commander deck, and the theme of our deck is obviously Bat Tribal. No, I'm kidding. Man, I really tried to make it work too. That was my first draft of this, but the bats are just so bad. They're just so bad. I don't know, maybe one day. Maybe WotC will be able to give us a good set of bats that we can like cobble together to make a commander deck. But as of 2023, this is just not there. So instead, we're gonna lean into the more obvious choice, which is discard. Now, I know people have mixed feelings when it comes to discard. Some players find it unfun, or they find it almost kind of like stacks done in a very black way. But I don't know, I feel like card draw engines of today are just so good. They get out of control so quickly that, in a way, this is the god that EDH deserves, right? As EDH players, we've done this to ourselves. That said, this card can still be pretty tricky to pull off because it just plays so differently in multiplayer as opposed to 1v1. So we're gonna need to bring a different mentality when approaching this playstyle. And the reasons for which, I think, boils down to 3 major factors. The first is we have triple the opponents. It's gonna be difficult to race out and just have enough resources to be able to disable 3 different players. Secondly, because commander games just take so much longer, decks have more emphasis on their card draw. So we're gonna encounter more powerful and more consistent card draw engines than we would in a 1v1 format. Thirdly, because players will always have access to their commander, some commanders are already just built-in card draw advantage or card advantage engines all on their own. So it's gonna be difficult to just lock them out. And that's why our mentality shouldn't be to try and disable or lock opponents out of the game, but instead it's to slow them down and get them to play suboptimally. Suboptimal here meaning like we force them to play cards sooner than they'd want instead of saving them up for later when they might have more impact on the game. Now, I'll get into why I really like Aclazotz as our commander in a bit, but first we need to identify what role he's gonna play in our deck. And the role I've identified for him is that of an enabler. So our deck isn't dead in the water when he's not out there, but when he is, he's just gonna make our deck run so much better. And the reason for this is because when you're playing or leaning heavily into discard, once our opponents are empty-handed, all of a sudden, a lot of our spells in our deck are just useless, right? We lose impact on the game. Sure, people are top decking and all this, but when they already have stuff on board or the stuff on board already generate them value, we're gonna get outclassed pretty quick. And this is why I really like Aclazotz, because when we've done all that hard work, we've made our opponents empty-handed, right? He turns our hard work into value for us. So it's highly possible that our opponents will have no cards in hand, but we have a bunch, possibly even a full grip. And so this can let us play more optimal than our opponents. A barrier we'll face though is closing out games. Because this card can be powerful, but if that's all we're doing and we can't close it out, then essentially we're just like a sideshow to the game. And we're a side quest that they just needed to beat. So we'll need dedicated finishers just to make sure that we can close things out. Last thing I want to say, even if it seems obvious, is I want to emphasize the importance of ramp. Discard engines are usually pretty expensive, both in terms of wallet as well as mana value. So ramp makes sure that we get our pieces out at a decent time so that we can maximize the impact that they'll have on the game. Now again, I do acknowledge that not everybody is going to be a fan of discard, and so I don't think this is a deck that we're always going to be playing. In a way, it's going to be like a secondary deck, a deck that will play as a change of pace. Which is why, for this build, we went with a budget. As of the recording of this video, as per MTG Goldfish, this deck clocks in at just under $85, or more precisely, at $83.65, excluding our lands and our commander. This was actually pretty hard to cut down because there are just so many good discard pieces that are pretty pricey. But again, if this is just gonna be something that you'll be playing occasionally, it's probably not worth investing all that money into, especially if they're just gonna be like really niche cards. I'll go into the deck's specific card choices and I'll be bucketing them into 7 central themes. We'll have our usuals of ramp, removal, and draw, but I'll first tackle card choices covering discard, rack, repeat, and something we like to call UBP, or utilities, bombs, and pets. Discard is central to our game plan, and getting opponents empty-handed is pretty much what turns our commander into a draw engine. Necrogoyf and Cunning Lethomancer are consistent source of discard effects, with Necrogoyf triggering every player's upkeep, and Lethomancer triggering on our upkeep. Oppression is a 3-mana value enchantment that recently got a reprint during Wilds of Feldrain, and it's just so efficient for what it does. It also forces our opponents to make tough choices, cause essentially it kinda cuts their hand in half. Bugler Rat, Elderfang Disciple, and Nezumi Informant all read fairly similarly, and they force discards from our opponents. So this is good because at least it doesn't force us to discard, while putting everybody else down 1 card. Mindrake, I find, is a good, cheap source of discard. I know it's a one-time effect, but having to just overload it for 2 to discard 2 is pretty impactful, especially in the mid-game when players have played out a few spells. While Mind Slicer is just a bomb, it's pretty scary because it makes opponents discard their entire hand. And while it is a little salty, I think people can excuse it given the context of our deck. Finally, Rankle, Master of Pranks, just another source of consistent discard. Having flying and haste means we can get value from it immediately, and it can even act as a little removal spell if we make players sacrifice a creature. Now, I've been playing Mono Black for a long time, and Racking Fools is something I've definitely missed doing. It comes from this old school card called the Rack. It's a 1-mana value artifact spell, and it can essentially deal up to 3 damage if an opponent is empty-handed. Rackling is essentially a creature version of the Rack, while Shrieking Affliction is essentially the same thing, but it's a little more forgiving in that if an opponent has 1 card in hand, at least it'll still deal 3 damage. It is all or nothing though. Nezumi Shortfang has a targeted discard, which is not really that efficient for our purposes, but if an opponent has no more cards in hand, we can then flip it and it becomes Stab Whisker the Odious. Again, essentially working like another rack effect. Quest for the Nile Stone is something we can turn on pretty quickly with maybe just 1 Bugler Rat, and moving forward, if an opponent is empty-handed to start their turn, they are gonna take 5 damage. Megrim is honestly not that great. At 3-mana value, it comes in a little later than we'd like. Liliana's Caress would really be the sweet spot here, but Liliana's Caress is expensive, and Megrim is dirt cheap, and it's a decent enough effect, giving some incremental damage to discards. Painful Quandary is a 5-mana value enchantment, and it forces opponents to make a choice if they want to discard, or if they don't want to, or if they can't, then we deal them 5 damage. Last on the list is Polluted Bonds, and something I've noticed when playing discard is that when opponents are empty-handed and they draw land for turn, they play it, and essentially we get no benefit out of it. So this is just a way to cover our bases and make sure that even if an opponent will play their land, at least we're able to get some damage in. Now, some of our cards are going to be forcing us to discard as well, and so we need some way to mitigate that. Phyrexian Reclamation, I find, is one of the best card staples in Black. Just lets us return a creature from our graveyard to our hand for just 2 and 2 life. While Grave Scrabbler is a card that we'll probably want to pay for its madness cost, and it essentially swaps places for a card that's already in our graveyard. Gollum Patient Plotter has an ability that allows us to bring it back from our graveyard to our hand. Now, normally we want to bring cards to the battlefield, but since we're in the discard theme, getting a creature back to hand is actually pretty important. We can sacrifice a Bugler Rat, and then Gollum is again in our hand, ready to be discarded. With all the discarding going on, though, occasionally a bomb gets discarded into our opponent's graveyards. Well, I mean, they're probably playing more value creatures than us. So Demon of Dark Schemes and Chainer are ways to be able to harvest that value from an opponent's graveyard and put them into play under our control. While Breach the Multiverse is just a bomb of a spell at 7 mana value, we essentially get to mill 10 from each player and choose the best creature or planeswalker that's in that graveyard and put it under our control. Now, as I mentioned, ramp is important to our game plan because a lot of our best pieces come higher in the curve. We do run staples in Soul Ring, Signet, Bauble, and Felwar Stone, nothing new to see here. But we do run Dark Ritual and Bog Witch. Both cards read fairly similarly, just to give us that burst of mana and hopefully get us from early game into the mid or even late game. Sildevi Adnate and Illuminer's Seras are pretty good sources of mana as well. They just give us that short burst of mana. We don't need to sacrifice big things here, but just getting us ahead on curve is already a pretty big deal. Defiler of Flesh is a 4 mana value 4/4, which lets us essentially pay Phyrexian mana for our black permanents. We are playing some pretty hefty enchantments and things like this, and so the cost reduction is going to be welcome, and it's going to be way more budget than leaning into something like a Jet Medallion. We are running some sources of explosive ramp, and Nyx Lotus generates mana based off of our devotion. Since we're running many black permanents, it's probably generate a good chunk of mana, while Black Market is a card that I've just seen always do a lot of work when it comes to like the longer games, and since we're playing this card, the game is probably gonna go a bit longer than usual. Removal is a necessity for our deck, because once cards get out of our opponent's hands and onto the battlefield, it essentially becomes a threat. Big Game Hunter is a card that we can discard and pay 1 for its madness cost to take down a big creature, while Plague Crafter is just a good edict effect, and if a player has no creature in play, we then make them discard a card. Isildur's Fateful Strike is also a card that I've always wanted to use, and we can destroy a creature, but more importantly, if a player has so many cards in their hand for some reason, we then make them discard all the way down to 4. We're also running a bunch of wipes in Mutilate, which is a good budget option, and Yahenri's Expertise is the same mana value but only giving creatures -3/-3, but I really value in it being able to ramp us by essentially letting us play a card, any card, with mana cost 3 or less. Decree of Pain can be a bomb because it's essentially a wrath, but it also draws us a lot of cards to then be able to refuel and restock our hand. Finally, Feed the Swarm and Oblivion Stone, just good sources of non-creature removal that I think every deck will need. Making our opponents discard is fun, but we need to make sure we have enough fuel to keep drawing into threats. One way we can do that is by profiting off of their discards. Siphon Mind makes every player discard, and we draw a card for each card discarded that way. Gets Grimoire lets us draw whenever an opponent discards, and Tiny Bones is both a draw engine as well as a finisher if our opponents have no more cards in their hand. And Asylum Visitor actually lets us profit off of players being empty-handed because it triggers on each player's upkeep. If they have no cards in hand, then we get to draw a card for the price of 1 life. We do want some unconditional card draw though, and Phyrexian Arena, Call of the Ring, and Bloodgift Demon all let us draw an extra card during our upkeep. A less talked about mode of Aclazotz though is that whenever an opponent discards a land card, we then create a bat. So it's highly probable that we'll actually get more tokens than we think, and Rowan's Grim Search lets us bargain 1 so that we can essentially look at 4 and draw 2 of them. Skullclamp essentially lets us cash in our bats for card draw, while Dark Prophecy is just a good card that I've just seen provide consistent value over the course of a game. I also like that it provides 3 devotion, good for that Nyx Lotus, and I like how it doesn't specify non-token creature, meaning if our bats chump block or we Skullclamp them, we then get to draw an extra card off of it. Last on the card draw list is Temple Bell. Now this might seem counterintuitive because we're trying to make opponents discard, and here we are drawing them cards. But if we have, let's say, an effect like the Cunning Lethomancer, which makes every player discard a card. If they're empty-handed, that's essentially no value for us. So this is just a good way to be able to draw an extra card for us while also making sure that they're essentially milling the top card of their library. UBP time! Alright, we need finishers, and I'll talk about them in a bit, but first, Sangromancer just provides a ton of value. Whenever they discard a card, we gain 3 life, and incidental life gain is actually pretty good, especially when we're running a deck that can be quite annoying like this one. Waste Not is a powerhouse in any discard deck, and I like that it got a reprint in Wilds of Eldraine. It made the card a lot cheaper, but it just gives so much value in giving either a creature, ramping us ahead, or drawing us a card. The Raven Man is another good source of token production. I know it makes birds that can't block, unlike Aclazotz where the bats can block, but still really good for sack fodder, really good for attacking, and even has this activated ability, a bit expensive, but in a pinch we'll probably activate it to make each opponent discard a card. The Haunt of Hightower is a 6 mana value 3/3 that also forces a discard when it attacks, but it also grows itself over time and it can be a pretty big beater, plus it has lifelink. Cards like Bone Horde and Night Howler care about how many creatures there are in all the graveyards. It can make Aclazotz really big because it can either equip or bestow, and if there was a wrath or something to happen, At least they're reusable because the Night Howler will just fall off, become a creature itself, or the Bone Horde we can just always re-equip again. Much like Temple Bell, Master of the Feast is a 3-mana value 5/5 demon that draws our opponents a card. Now this can be bad if we don't have a consistent discard engine going, and so sometimes we'll play this, sometimes we'll just keep it in our hand and discard it away. Last couple of cards in the deck are dedicated to finishers, and Grey Merchant of Asphodel is one of the classic premier finishers in black. Each opponent loses life equal to our devotion to black, and we gain life equal to that amount. The gain life is nice, but really being able to make opponents lose a chunk of life is why it makes the cut. Our last card in the deck is Wound Reflection. Again, another way to double up all the damage that we're dealing, so that Megrim that dealt 2 is now dealing 4, the Nile Stone that dealt 5 is now dealing 10. Just another good way to close out and make all those incremental hits really hurt. And that's it for this episode. Hope you guys found that useful. If you did, I hope you could show some love to the channel by leaving a like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. We will be doing at least one more deck tech covering the Lost Caverns of Ixalan cards. But until next time, stay inspired, friends, and I'll see you soon.